Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. Happy International Leadership Week. For those of you joining us, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here exploring this year's theme of the power of your network. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Hobbis. I'm the founder of the Step Up Network, and we're hosting this in collaboration with lots of different organisations. And if you've been to a Step Up event, whether that be a face-to-face one or a virtual one, we always start with a welcome. And this year, this event rather, I wanted to focus more so, not so much on Step Up, but actually looking at what International Leadership Week is and why we are hosting this event. So, starting with why, International Leadership Week is an annual event organised by the Institute of Leadership, and the Institute of Leadership is a global organisation that connects people who are interested in, working within, developing in leadership across a number of different sectors. So tonight, pretty much all of our speakers and panelists are people within the education sector. However, what we wanted to do was connect the Institute of Leadership's work cross-sector with those in education, because networking and education is a really interesting space to navigate. So each year there is a theme, and this year's theme is the power of your network. So if you just type in International Leadership Week 2026 into Google, type in the Institute of Leadership, you'll find so much information about events across the country. Karen, the events manager, and the team have done a fantastic job at curating a fantastic range of events, both virtual and in person. And there's a number of events like this where they're not necessarily being directly ran by the Institute, but being ran in partnership with them. And personally, part of the reason why we wanted to do that is, one, because of the topic, the power of your network, but two, we wanted to do it because the Institute for us has really helped Step Up develop this year. We started our relationship with the Institute in 2024 when we were shortlisted for one of their awards at their annual award ceremony. And then we have worked with them and collaborated with them ever since. So do go and check them out because they are a fantastic organisation to be affiliated with and to work with. And I know I've gained so much as a leader and just as a person, as someone to be connected with other people because of them. So do go and check them out. You'll see a range of events happening in person this week to celebrate this year's theme and work. So thinking about why we're doing that, we also know that actually, particularly in education, the navigating that idea of networking can be quite difficult because it's very different to other industries and sectors. If I was working in, I don't know, a law firm or a bank in, the centre of London, my ability to network and my experience of networking would be very different than me sat in my classroom in Birmingham. It is a very different space to navigate, and that's why we wanted to explore that this year. So in terms of the what and the how, this year, International Leadership Week is focusing on the power of your network. And these are then sort of the subtopics to that theme. And what we've done tonight is tonight's session is going to be a panel discussion. So in the moment, I'll stop sharing my screen, and we are going to spend around 10 minutes on each of these topics. So looking at breaking down these topics even more so that you have a really astute and aware understanding of what networking looks like and how that particularly aligns with education. And so what I've tried to do to help me with this, explore this topic, is connect with some of the best connected people I know in education, some of the best networkers. There are so many other people I could have asked as well. I think I could have probably filled like the whole screen with the amount of people who are fantastic networkers and connectors within the education sphere. And I'm not going to introduce them because I'm sure they're much better at doing that than I. So I'm going to bring them on to the screen now, and then we will get started. First of all, starting with our introduction. So I'm going to gradually bring them in. Good evening, everybody. Happy International Leadership Week. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. So, as I just said, we'll start with introductions, if that's okay. So just an overview of who you are, maybe some of the networks you're connected with and founded and lead, and then we'll get into the discussion. So to make it easy for me, I will go clockwise order from me on the screen. So Yamina, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, I'm Yamina Bibi. I am a former deputy head teacher and currently an education project specialist and teacher and learning consultant. And how many networks am I part of? I should probably just name the networks I'm not part of, maybe. I think everyone's laughing there because it's true. But I am a diverse educator / belonging effect associate. I'm a women-led network leader in London, and I am co-founder of South Asian Educators Network.
Thank you, Yamina. Yeah, I mean, that probably was a good idea to name the networks we're not part of here. Yeah, probably a really good way to start. Thank you, Yamina. Janoy, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Hope you're well. So my name is Janoy Joseph. I'm an assistant head teacher in South London, and I'm also the co-founder of Black Men Teach. In its own network itself. In terms of networks that I found myself a part of, I think over the years I've really contributed a lot, gone into a lot, but the most has really kind of contributed to who I am and the makeup of myself. I have to be Aspiring Heads, Step Up Network, Black Teachers Connect, YBTN or Black Teachers Network. So yeah, a lot of those different spaces, and as well as some of the affinity groups from Teach First as well. So
that's great. Thank you, Janoy. Hannah.
Evening all. Great to be here. So grassroots network-wise, I'm the co-founder of Women Ed, the co-founder of Diverse Ed, now the Belonging Effect, and I've set up women leadership networks in Oxfordshire and Bath and for Lean-In Girls. But I'm also in formal networks, so like an NPQH network, a head teacher network, and a chair of governors network. So I think it's interesting to think about the formal versus the informal and what you need at different stages of your career, because there's some networks I perhaps pull back from because other networks become more important to me in the season I'm currently in my career.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Hannah. Thank you. And we'll definitely touch on that later, is that formality and informality that you sometimes need. And also that transience that you need. Sometimes you really need a network at certain points and different points in your life and career. That's so important. So thank you for highlighting that. And last but by no means least, Tim.
Big shoes to follow. So my name's Tim Mobbs. I'm head of ambassadors and community at Teach First, and I've had the privilege of working, I think, with everyone on this call multiple times across various networks, shockingly. And across kind of the last 5 years, I've had the privilege to lead alumni work at Teach First, which has a huge kind of emphasis on networking and the power of connection. Over that time, again, had the privilege of working with and starting over 200 networks within education, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and more recently, really kind of focusing on what does quality of delivery for networks look like to provide an excellent experience with moments of magic that's consistent for people who do join networks. And I think that makes the difference.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tim. And you've heard that part of the reason why we created this lineup was because of the amount of networks we're involved. I nearly contemplated asking everyone to could you send all the logos of networks you're involved? But I don't think a slide would be big enough to get them all on. And especially, like, as we said there, the informal and informal networks and networks you was a part of, networks you're still a part of, and so on and so forth. So as I said in the introduction, we are going to navigate this webinar through looking at breaking down that theme of the power of your network for this year's International Leadership Week. And looking at those 5 key topics, we're going to ask one question to our panel, and we'll sort of start with different people each time. But please also, if you have any other questions or comments, people have already started, so thank you so much. Please do pop them in the comments, because it'd be great to share them and share them with our panel. So we're going to start off by thinking about the theme of building and sustaining powerful networks. And ultimately, we can interpret that as more formal networks, as in actual ones that have become organizations, or ones where you actually just curate your own network. Now, I think one of the things in education that is not taught, and I know I've heard some of you say this before, is actually that ability to network. You're often not taught how to navigate that space, particularly from very early in your career. It can feel quite daunting to go to a training session and you're expected to network, or to go to a conference and expected to network. So thinking about that, if we think from starting at scratch about how we want to create connections that endure and add real value to us and our careers and our lives, starting from scratch, how can you build your own network? How can you start from scratch and create and curate that network? So we'll go back in that same order, and then I'll change the order up each time. So Yamina, if I could come to you first on that one, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to what 10 years ago now when I first started, and I went on X, what was Twitter back then, to just stalk Ed Sheeran is the joke, but it's genuinely the truth. I was just following Ed Sheeran, and then all of a sudden discovered EduTwitter essentially, and the first person I saw on there was Hannah Wilson. So it's just a full circle moment to be here with Hannah, talk about network, because all of those networks that I've found as a result of that connection, my connection with Hannah, has just been so significant to my career. And it started just by following Hannah, watching the work that she's doing, and then connected with organizations like Women Ed, which was just, you know, five co-founders talking about women in leadership. And I was just so admired the work that they did, and then ended up going to just following those colleagues as well, and then going to a conference. And I think that for me was really important, about who I was following on social media, not necessarily saying anything. It might be really weird, but genuinely just observing, just watching, just really engaging with them, liking and commenting maybe, and then like going to a conference, and how life-changing that moment was. And it was through Hannah, if I'm being really honest, that I found all those other networks. So I think when you're thinking about how do you build that, it's really following those colleagues that you admire, those people that you admire, and kind of maybe liking what they're saying, commenting with what they're saying, and engaging. And I know it's really daunting, and I know that I'm an extrovert, so it's really easy for me to say, and I'm very aware of that. But from an introvert point of view, following and engaging and liking, and maybe even attending a conference if you're feeling brave enough to kind of share that and connect with others as well who might be like-minded.
That's great. Thank you, Yamina. Some really good tips there. Janoy, how about you? What do you say to start from scratch, how to build your own network?
That really, like, am I muted? How long have we been doing online stuff now, and we're still making silly mistakes? I think one thing I'll say, just to kind of echo some aspects of what Yamina said, that really shone through with myself, is a level of like sincerity and being quite genuine when you're coming to really connect with somebody. You're not connected to see what you can kind of get out of them, but more so see how you can really add value. And I think for myself, earlier in my career, I realized that ultimate networking isn't about like collecting contacts necessarily, but it's more so about contributing to communities. And if I think about everything that I've kind of done from since I was a PGC student until now, whether it was like supporting school initiatives or mentoring students or collaborating with colleagues across departments and from one school to the next, I think people ultimately saw the value that I was able to kind of bring. And so for me, as a result of this, a lot of opportunities came because my work, my values, what I stood for, spoke on my behalf and well in advance. And so essentially when I did become an assistant head teacher, and how I became an assistant head teacher, and the stories and the connections do that, was a result of the fact that people was able to testify the fact that I was able to add to the collective. I was able to add value to a network. And so what I would say, if you're going to start a network, it's literally all about building through contributions, not necessarily through contacts. And what I mean by contributions, like sometimes people are doing amazing things. You don't necessarily need to start your own thing, but you can actually connect and add a different perspective. And I think contributing to the greater conversation speaks a lot more volume.
Yeah, that's really important. That sort of reciprocal approach that we expect, that it is a network. It's not a one-way thing that, I give and I get back and things like that. I think that's really important. Thank you, Janai. Hannah, if I can come to you next.
I'm feeling old because I think I'm going back like 15 years now when I first joined Twitter. And I was just a bit of a teacher geek. Like, I love teaching. And I was like, no one's talking about teaching in my school. Like, my school was great, but a bit insular and a bit inward facing. And similar to me, like, I'm an extrovert. I love people. I love connectivity. So I joined Twitter, but I hated it, so I left it. So then I joined LinkedIn, didn't get it, so I left it. So what I did do was I found Teach Meets, and I started going, like, back then, like, London was on fire with Teach Meets. I was probably going to a Teach Meet every fortnight. And then through the Teach Meets, I met people who are on Twitter. So I then rejoined Twitter and I began to understand the kind of rules of engagement. And that then led to me, as I stepped into deputy headship and I was the only female on SLT, needing a network of female leaders. So at that point, we had the brilliant platform Staff Room. It used to be a blogging community that Peps McRae started. It was just a beautiful space. And a group of us did a series of blogs about gender equality. And that's how Women Ed started. Going back to your point, Joy, it was values alignment. It was people who didn't know each other, who had shared values, shared vision, and a shared problem. And we came together to start Women Ed. So that's where I kind of got the appetite for it. And then I did go back onto LinkedIn because I think Twitter was great at that time for finding people, but you didn't always know where they were, what they were doing. Like they were quite like anonymous, like a daisy with some letters was their username. Whereas on LinkedIn, you could be more intentional. And as I left London to move to be a head teacher in a different county and I relocated, I used LinkedIn to build my network before I even arrived. I found every head teacher, chair of governors in the county, and I reached out to them. And I had a ready-made kind of like network to support me as I transitioned. So I think there's a mixture there of the kind of the grassroots, using Twitter quite informally, going to events, to actually being quite intentionally strategic about who I needed to connect with as well.
Thanks, Hannah. That importance of intentionality in terms of networking, I think will come through with quite a lot of the other topics we'll talk about as well. So thank you for that. And Tim.
Now, Ben, I think I heard a timer go off, which I'm assuming means we're at time for this question. So I will keep this short and sweet. I think there's two answers to this question. I think there's how you start your personal own network and how do you start a network. So I think I'll zoom in on the first one because I think people have touched on the second one quite a lot. And I think the first one is just realizing that networking is incredibly uncomfortable and it can feel very, very awkward for a lot of people. And I think just leaning into that and understanding that that's okay. And even the most expert networkers who look like they don't feel like that, I would argue probably still do feel like that a lot of the time. And I think the second part of that is just start saying yes to things, like turn up. Like there is so much goodwill out there in education that people want to help you. And it's like, it's always astonishing to me how often people say yes. Like, I can't remember someone actually turn around saying no. So I think just knowing that that is most people's kind of outlook. So say yes to things and lean into the awkwardness.
That's great. Thank you for that, Tim. And I think so much important, like you said there, actually finding those spaces to connect, and actually if it's not your space, that's fine, and go and find another space and that sort of thing and keep moving. So yeah, thank you for that. Thank you everyone for those contributions. I think that were really useful. And yeah, that was we could have broken that down into two questions, as Tim said there, like actually starting physically leading a network, but also curating a network. So thinking about that curating the network, we've sort of touched on this very much, but one of the other themes in this year's International Leadership Week is about that idea of connective leadership and collective wisdom. So that harnessing the power of collaboration to drive smarter decisions. So we've talked a lot about what was very clear about that is that intentionality around networking. But then it's also about being intentional about interacting with the right people and the right organizations. So my next question is, and I know we have touched on this already briefly, but how do you do that? How do you make sure you are connecting with the right people, your people, the right organizations for you? If I could come to Hannah first for this one, please.
Yeah, this question really resonates with me. So I have a habit of relocating, and I relocated again 2.5 years ago. And my previous relocations have been for a job. So you kind of have an in for building a network, whereas I've relocated here because I want to live in Bath. But I work from home or I work on the road. So like I'm not ahead. I don't work in education locally, regionally. It's been much harder to actually do that intentional networking. And I've created 3 spaces that have taken time. It's been like 2.5 years now. But I set up a diversity hub in Bristol, which is about 15 minutes from Bath. And I've met every half term for 3 years a group of people who care about DEIB. And we've grown slowly but very intentionally a values aligned group. So I'm not sure it's like the right people, but it's the people who want to be in the room talking about that topic. As a woman leader of a business, I also wanted to network with women who weren't in education. I love educators, but it's not like I'm a business owner. So I was looking for women leadership networks. I couldn't believe in 2023 there wasn't one in Bath. So I started one. So I co-founded I founded the Women Leadership Network in Baines. And in 2.5 years, we've picked up 850 people who want to be in that space because that space didn't exist. And I've just built that through LinkedIn. And then through those two things, I got approached by a group of global majority educators from Bristol who wanted to launch a REND. And I'd been to a lot of the racial equity networking dinners elsewhere in the country. And even though I'm white, they know I organise events and I run networks. So I came on board as one of the organisers of REND. So those three spaces are all what I care about. People I want to be very aligned with, connecting with, collaborating with. It's not really about work or money. It's more about like who I want to be in conversation with.
That's great. Thank you, Hannah. Tim, if I can come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think finding the right people is an interesting one, and I think from experience, like we've tried lots of different things, and I think the thing that really shines out of working is having a very clear purpose for the network. I think the clearer the purpose, the more you find the right people because the people gravitate towards the purpose. I think where it's wishy-washy or if it's just like a really general theme, then I think what we've seen previously is actually you get quite a big uptake because obviously the bucket is broader, but then engagement is much lower because people kind of come, join, and then it's like, not 100% sure this is for me. And I think the interesting thing, I think, with a lot of networks is you kind of have one shot with members. If they come and have not a great experience, I think you kind of keep their information, but you've lost them as a member. So I think that's why I said right at the start, like we're really pushing for consistency with moments of magic. Like how do you make people feel they belong? How do you make it really clear that like this is a space for them? And how do you like build an onboarding process that really kind of sweeps people in so they feel at home? So I think that's the other thing is it's quite easy to join lots of networks, but it can be quite a daunting thing joining particularly virtual spaces where you don't know anybody. Like it's essentially a group of strangers. Like each network has its own culture, and it's like, well, how do I fit in here? Like, how do I behave? What are the rules? And it's quite difficult, I think, to access to start with. So I think having a really clear purpose and a great onboarding experience kind of makes the difference.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate that. Yamina, if I can come to you next.
I think for me, just thinking about my own experiences, I will find through social media or through my networks actual conferences that I can go and meet people live because that's how I get my energy. I get energy from meeting people face to face. As much as I post, I know I post a lot, but actually the most of my energy comes from when I meet lots of people who are what some may call like my tribe, and sometimes they're not my tribe, but being in that space makes me understand that and see whether our values aligned. So I'm thinking about spaces that I've attended for, like, for example, you know, the grassroots organizations that I've mentioned have really connected with me and I've stayed with for such a long time now. But then also some places where I've gone and then left and maybe come back, and I really love what Tim and Hannah have talked about in terms of like creating your own space, finding those right people, but also things like affinity groups. And I guess I'm thinking about one specific moment when I left the inaugural Diverse Educators Conference when it was first launched, and myself and a couple of us colleagues, and you know some, literally came from this one school, left, and then straight away started our own network within the school, which has now become an affinity group across the trust. I think, how long has it been? Nearly 9 years later. And I think that just shows that 4 of us sat in a car where I drove really badly all the way to this conference and then left and started this network where people it was just 5 of us to begin with, but that was in school. And I think sometimes when we think about networks, we think of external networks, but we can curate and create those networks within our own organizations, because those are the colleagues that we're meeting and people we're meeting all the time, especially if you're in school. And maybe thinking about how you build those internal networks is just as powerful as how much you build those external networks. So even though I'm no longer part of that organization and I'm kind of external to that, I'm still in contact with those colleagues. I still contribute to that voice, and they've still kept that legacy going. Just shows the power of like finding the right tribe, I guess, but also the legacy of what you might leave as well.
That's great. Thank you, Yamina. And legacy is definitely another theme we're going to be picking up today. I love how all these themes are interweaving in all of our chats. It's brilliant. Thank you. Last but no means least, Janoy, could you let us know how can you connect with the right people, right organizations?
Yeah, everyone has said some amazing things. I don't necessarily know where I could kind of take it. But I think for me, like this whole concept of the right person or the right people in quotation mark is something that I'm a bit uneasy about, because what makes the right person, right? I think the first thing I'd say, the right person isn't necessarily a connection that is transactional. I don't think, nor do I believe, nor do I subscribe to that thought. I think when we consider the right person, or our tribe, as Yamina kind of mentioned, a lot of it goes pretty much deeper in the concept of like just values, and I think as opposed to titles or positions, and it definitely comes down to this whole idea that the right people, the right people will always speak a certain language that would either invigorate you to kind of move forward or press on, or move from belonging to mattering, where you are actually actively participating in the network. So I think I'll just camp here right at that point there, where it's all about values, not necessarily titles, but it's more so a case about being quite generous in what you have to offer and not necessarily what you have to take.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on that discussion, Janoy, in terms of, remembering that a network is as much about giving as receiving, in terms of, that sort of mutual, that mutual respect we have for one another, but that values alignment is really important. And actually knowing that if you're in a space where actually your values are being compromised, then that probably isn't the right space or the right people, as you say, in inverted commas, to be around. So thank you for that. Thank you, everyone, for that. That was a great discussion. So we're now going to move on to our next topic. And I think this is a topic that links very well to a lot of the work people are currently involved in. So we're going to move on to the next theme of diversity, inclusion, and global connectivity. So this theme for this topic within the theme for International Leadership Week is all about exploring how diverse networks can fuel that innovation, but also broaden our perspectives. And by the term diverse, we mean diverse in thought, diverse in people, in, when we think about things like protected characteristics, we think about identity and belonging. So when I talk about diverse, I mean it in lots of different forms here. So the next question is how, and linking to what we've talked about just, but how can you curate and also create networks? And by that, I don't just necessarily mean formal networks, but your own sort of personal network. But how can you curate and create those spaces so they are diverse, inclusive, and representative of what the purpose of that network is? Janoy, if I could start with you on that one, please.
I was just about to mute myself, Sure thing. This is the question I'd probably say where I do believe there's a level of intentionality needs to kind of take place, but more so along the lines of intentionality about representation. I think if you ask yourself the question of, especially in leaders or whoever, is leading a network, is the key question to ask is, whose voices are missing from this conversation. And I think that will almost kind of like steer you into the next phase of who is it that you need to ultimately create a space for at the table so they can be heard, but more so for they can actually challenge a lot of the biases that we hold. It doesn't matter, the color of your skin, we all have biases. So we do need others and other perspective, other lenses to kind of speak into that. And I think when networks include people from different backgrounds, sectors, experiences, life chances, etc., it just becomes a much richer and engaging conversation. And that can only come through intentionality.
Thank you, Janoy. That's great. Thank you. Hannah, if I can come to you next, please.
So many things I want to say on this one. I've got a two-part response. So around the diversity piece, like it's designing for the space to be diverse, inclusive, and accessible, and whether that's virtual or in person. So I've been on crutches the last few weeks. I hurt my knee, and I went to an event, and it's really hard to network when you're on crutches. It's really hard. And I thought completely differently about being in that space, and it made me think, as someone who holds space for others, there's so much more I need to do around ableism and around accessibility and mobility. And I was just on crutches for a few weeks, but we were in this space for 2 hours in a networking event, and there were no chairs, and there were people there who were pregnant and disabled who had nowhere to sit down. So I went into bossy Hannah mode and went to find the organizer and asked them to find some chairs. And when I was actually then interviewed as part of the event, I talked about we just need to be a bit more mindful and check our own privileges about the spaces we're creating. One of my teams recently run some training for a group of people who were deaf and had to completely redesign how they were delivering their training for that space. So that's my first thought. My second thought is actually about the bit in the question around internationalism. So my network blew up during lockdown because we were running loads of free virtual events. And one of our virtual events in June 2021 had 13,500 people at it. Like, it was absolutely off the charts. And suddenly our connectivity went international. And that's really interesting to then think about how you navigate time zones, how you navigate different cultural differences. And I did not think I'd then be ending up organising a women leadership conference in Dubai. But through my network with Dubai schools, they saw what I was doing in Bath and like, can you help us? We want a women leadership network over here. So for the last 2 years, I've been co-organising from Bath a women leadership network and event in the UAE. So it's funny how you find connections you're not often looking for. I've now pulled back because I haven't got the capacity to be organising an event I can't go to regularly. But I think it's interesting where you end up finding people in unlikely places sometimes as well.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think it is about that mindfulness of when people are checking in and checking events, particularly virtual events. If you're a UK-based organiser, it's so easy to think just about you and your time zone. I had the same thing last week with someone in Lisbon, and luckily they're in the same time zone, but I didn't even know until they started talking to me. But yeah, it's really important to consider. Thank you, Hannah, for that. Yamina, if I could come to you next, please.
Yeah, just to echo what everybody else said about intentionality and just being really deliberate in who we invite into spaces. I think there's no excuse anymore to have a really homogenous group of people, for example, talking about specific things and assuming that they're the only experts in a room or the only kind of people who can talk about that. And just there's so much out there now where you've got speakers lists that have a diversity in terms of thought, in terms of kind of protected characteristics as well, and just to avoid that kind of cognitive bias and that echo chamber. Because I understand about, like, absolutely we should be thinking about how we find people who are aligned to our values as well, but sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and those unexperienced or inexperienced identities are just as powerful. And I just think about my own upbringing, for example, as a young person, and actually as I've grown older, as I've gone into my career, really doing some of the unlearning and really ensuring that my networks are wider than what I grew up with and what I believed to be true. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. And there really is no excuse now in 2026 to say I'm only going to have a homogenous group of people speaking at a lineup, for example, because there's so much out there to show that, particularly in education anyway, there is such expertise out there. So just being really intentional about that and going out there and avoiding the echo chamber is really important, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Yamina. And I think thinking about what you just said there, I love that you've said that because that's so important, but thinking about that as someone who is networking, but also the people that, if you're curating that network, so if you're physically holding that network space, yeah, actually it's not okay to have a lineup that isn't diverse and not representative in 2026. And actually, equally, if you're then the person engaging that networking, challenge it and be part of the solution and do it in a way where, like, oh, I know these great people, like I can recommend all these great people to you. Would you like me to connect you with them? I think it's a really good way. And I know many of us on this call have done that before. So thank you, Mina. Tim, if I could come to you for that question, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And just to call out, I've learned a huge amount from Hannah in this space, like someone leading this work in the sector for sure. Like, I remember attending back when it was Diverse Educators Before Belonging Effect sessions on passing the mic, and that's really stuck with me over the years of actually how do you give up kind of your opportunity to pass it to a colleague. And I think for me, there's two things here, and they both revolve around intentionality, which I think is the key word that keeps coming out. So every member of my brilliant team has a personal development goal based around this, which is about recruiting diverse memberships into our networks. And I think that's the intentionality to keep it front of mind for everybody so it doesn't slip off the radar. We have regular discussions about it. We challenge each other on how are we doing this. And then secondly, like, we've intentionally built it into the architecture of how we run networks. So over the last couple of years, as you know, Ben, we've kind of developed an areas of excellence framework, which we kind of base all of our network approaches around at Teach First. And that was very much based around the work in the Art of Gathering and Impact Networks, which are two brilliant books. I'll just read you a quote that kind of from both. The Art of Gathering talks about we all wear masks, and a lot of our network members have talked about like finally finding a place where it feels you can take your mask off and be amongst friends. So like we really honour that and understand, and that then links to kind of the key theme through Impact Networks, which kind of states that building trust is the work of networks. So we really try and meet members where they're at. We try and make sure that we build great relationships with them so we can support them to build great relationships with other members as well without being too controlling, and that's kind of what we build the networks around. And I think the other thing from Impact Networks that stands out is a quote that says, through that exploration of divergent perspectives, we discover the places where values converge. And I think that's the key. Like if we just had like the homogenous group that Yamina mentioned a minute ago, like we don't get that. So like a network is a better place if it's diverse.
Definitely, totally agree. Thank you for that, Tim. That's really, and I have to say, The Art of Gathering, which was a book that I know you and your team recommended me, is a great book, and it's really great one to engage with if you're trying to navigate this the field networking. Thank you for that. So that's brilliant. So we're now going to move on to our fourth topic. So fourth topic, we're now going to start considering legacy, and we did touch on legacy earlier. So one of the other topics being explored as part of this year's theme is that legacy around networks. So understanding how your connections leave a lasting impact on people and organizations, communities, and that. So Tim mentioned the phrase moments of magic, so I've sort of changed that and called it a magical moment. So considering your involvement in networks, and this could be both as a sort of a network leader or actually engaging in networking, feel free to take it as you wish. What would you say is a magical moment that has stayed with you around the power of networking? So through your involvement in networking over the years, and like I said, it could be as a person leading that network or engaging that network, what is a magical moment? And Tim, if I could come back to you for that one first, please.
Yes, when I first saw this question, so many, and like it's really difficult. I mean, being here on this call with you, Ben, is one. Like knowing, like seeing you when you first kind of got in touch and said, "Oh, I've got this idea of how we make the early careers network something else," and like just to see kind of step up growing. And like I think I had a proud moment when we've reached 1,000 followers like up on LinkedIn, and kind of seeing the journey that you've taken this network on alongside the brilliant volunteers that you work with is a magical moment. Like to see it from inception of idea through to like the growing force it is wonderful. So you should take the flowers on that. And then there's personal moments of magic as well with individual members. So again, I think one of the proudest parts of my career to date is working with the 100 Black Head Teachers Network. And again, seeing them from the first moment where 5 brilliant people came together in London alongside my team and like had this big scary idea of what can we do to make a dent in education. And they've got like the incredible goal of getting 100 Black Head teachers by 2038 into the system, which will fundamentally shift. But seeing those first 5 members, 3 of whom are now heads, like is incredible. And it's working. And like just being able to go to that group is a privilege and is a magic moment every single time I step into the room with any of the members. And visiting Daniel in his school as head, king of the castle, walked us around, was just like, this is it, right? This is it.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for sharing all those. I think, yeah, that idea of inception of an idea through to what it can become is a really magical moment. I definitely think that's something I take away. So thank you for that. Yamina, if I can come to you next, please.
This is the hardest question. I just have to say that the book I ended up writing, I would never have written it without the network. You know, the person who told me to write a blog, it's so vast that I just think about all the people who contribute. Oh, thanks, Hannah. I have your book here too. Don't worry. But genuine mutual love. But like when I think about how I even got to write, I never wanted to write a book. I never thought, as somebody who's dyslexic, I just never thought it was in my, like, even though I'm an English teacher, I just never thought I'd do it. And it was my editor who then contacted me through my blog. And I only wrote that blog because somebody on Twitter was like, you should write these things down. And I was like, oh, all right then. And, you know, I just think about moments that actually weren't very intentional, just to share some ideas around teaching learning or teaching English, that then meant that I widened my network to then that somebody in my network, and I think it was Amjad Ali, but I actually don't know for sure. He'll probably claim it was him, who had said to my editor, you should go and, get in touch with Yamina, should be a great writer for a book, who then contacted me and then led to this book. It's, for me, is like extraordinary, and this shows the power of network. Somebody who genuinely did not even have any desire to write a book, didn't think I was capable of writing a book, and then through my network, like Hannah being my coach, being like, you need to make sure you do it by this deadline, and that magical moment, I think, was my book launch, when I sat in that school and Ben, you were there, and genuinely just seeing all the different networks come together in one room. It was like This Is Your Life, but the most weirdest version. All these networks that I'd curated, including my personal and professional networks, sat in that room, was really powerful for me, and that only happened because of the networks that I grew online and then in person as well.
Thanks, Yamina, and that definitely is a magical moment. Like, well done for that book. That book is great, and the book launch was really special. So yeah, definitely, thank you. Jonoy, if I can come to you next.
Yeah, so I think if I go off what everyone was saying about personal and professional, I would say a professional one, magical moment for myself. And I keep, whenever I run into this person, I keep telling them, like, I'm going to cash in on this opportunity that I created. So we had a Black Men Teach event where we were putting on a revision seminar for boys in year 11. I was able to bring people who mentored myself, or who were also like different aspects of teachers in terms of positions, leadership. One of my friends, he volunteered as a tutor. He was looking for a job. He wanted to move schools, and it just so happened that the person who he was tutoring a young person with was in a position who was able to offer jobs. And he invited him to an interview in that moment in time. And then now he's somebody that's a senior middle leader at the school. And every time I run into him, I'm always saying that, look, you could have bailed on me on that day and not turn up, and look, where would you have been? So he laughs at it all the time. But I think what's so interesting is that, and it links to what Tim was saying, that sometimes when it comes to networking, you just have to say yes and just show up. And my friend, he's not really an extrovert. He would rather be at home. But that day, because he wanted to kind of help and give back to my network, he was able to kind of find himself now in a career where that's the case, in a job or in a school. Sorry, I think something personal for myself. The first time, I was applying for a role in terms of SLT, and I sat with the head teacher who was interviewing me, and he said, I already know a lot about you. I just want to have a conversation, and so on and so forth. And that really took a weight off myself, because it was in that moment I realized that the things I've been doing outside of, my school, with Black Men Teach, with other networks and so on and so forth, it really just set this sweet moment up for me, where I was, being interviewed as somebody that's quite credible in what I was talking about, and I wasn't exaggerating anything in any way, shape, or form. So I think those will be like my two main examples where I can testify to how networking actually works, and I've seen it.
That's great. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you for sharing those. And Hannah?
I think my magical moment and legacy is very much that I co-founded Women Ed, and for 3 years I was one of the driving forces behind it. And then I pulled back because I became a head teacher and didn't then think I was going to start Diverse Ed. That's a different story. But I'm so proud of what we started and how it's still growing. So even though I've not been involved for longer than I was involved, I flew out to Canada and launched Women Ed Canada. My mum's Canadian, my best friend lives out there. One of my mates from uni launched Women Ed Portugal. My clients in Brunei and Oman launched those chapters. So even though I'm not part of Women Ed anymore, I'm still connected. And if we think about international networks, last Sunday on International Women's Day, the MENA handle for Women Ed hosted a virtual safe space, and it was about career empowerment. And they flipped it to be about how everyone's feeling working out in the UAE right now. And I turned up as an ally, going back to Tim's point. I wasn't there to talk. I'm a white person in Bath, but I know people are hurting out there at the moment. So I just showed up to show my solidarity. And there were 3 of us from Europe and about 10 from the region. And they were blown away and quite emotional about the fact that we'd carved out time in our diary to go and support them. So I think it's that, like, you don't have to be in the room, you don't have to be in the country to sometimes support people. It's just knowing you've got someone at the end of a tweet or end of a LinkedIn email, whatever it might be, or on Zoom, who's got your back.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, everyone, because I knew when I was typing that question, I was like, if I was being asked that question, I would really struggle to put it down to one moment. So I appreciate that you all picked some really great moments there to share. And there probably is so many more that we could have probably spent the whole webinar actually just going through magical moments that we've encountered through networking. So moving on to our final thing. So we've just talked about legacy and very much the past as well. Also the future, and that's very much about what my next and final question is about. The final topic within this year's theme, the power of networking, is the future of networking. And we've referenced, obviously, between us a lot around grassroots networks and social media and blogging and connecting and so on. And we know that actually for many, quite very recently, that space has very much changed. If we think about, education, edu-Twitter and things like that, that's obviously a very different space now. So thinking about this evolving world, this evolving digital world, and more thinking about hybrid connections and so on and so forth, considering the current landscape, what is something that you are aware of or something that you might even be trying to work on about how we navigate networking in education moving forward? That could be in person, that could be virtual, because like we've said, lots of us have referenced things like Twitter as our starting point, or some form of social media as our starting point. And we know that is very much is changing and is in some cases quite a difficult space to navigate recently. So Yamina, could I come to you first for that one, please?
I was dreading that question. I think for me personally, I'm looking for spaces where we can mutually share and exchange ideas in a non-judgmental way, in a safe space where I can show up in my most authentic professional self, and be able to do that, and not an echo chamber necessarily, but definitely values aligned in some way. Whether that's online or whether that's face-to-face. Obviously, as I've mentioned, I'm somebody who loves the face-to-face events, but I'm a bit exhausted, if I'm being honest. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll know why. And I think, virtual conferences like this, for example, webinars, have made it easier to still feel connected and still be energized by people who share kind of same ideas or values or thoughts. And I think for me, going forward for the future, I'm thinking about that as somebody who's co-founder of South Asian Educators, and really thinking about that space, like how do we make it an inclusive space where we can still show up as our most authentic professional self, and how do we support colleagues and people to share and exchange ideas in a safe, inclusive way without feeling judged. Because I think that's one of the main reasons why lots of people are leaving spaces like X, for example, in their droves, is because they don't feel like they can share something and not be judged, for example. So just about how we might do that is really important to me, and I'm still thinking about how we might do that. But definitely, like, curating those safe spaces is really important, I think, for the future.
Yeah, and that builds on something obviously we talked about earlier, didn't we, about that whole idea of a network being powerful. One, it's got to be purposeful, but also that sense of belonging, and you've referenced there that safety, that psychological and physical safety that we must have about being in those spaces. So thank you, Mina, for that one. Janoy, if I could come to you next.
Yeah, I think for myself, if I had the last thing to say, I think it will have to come down to this whole concept of collective impact and collective improvement as well. And what I mean by that is it ultimately just comes down to the fact that true networks, I feel like there's space for everybody. I think we definitely don't need to be in competition. It's more so collaboration, truthfully. If we think about it, and I remember when I went to an event and somebody said this, and it's stuck with me. Is this whole idea that if I think about, for example, like Black Men Teach and what we're trying to do, there shouldn't actually be a Black Men Teach. I don't intend for Black Men Teach to be here for hundreds of years or whatever. And ultimately, because that is my ultimate goal, I am going to make sure that I am connected and collaborating with somebody or networks or individuals who also shares in that collective impact. And to kind of just shift it down when it comes to certain things. And so with that being said, I think the true essence of where networking should now be kind of visioned towards is this whole idea to really just have impact, collective impact where possible, bring people together, let people, both belong and matter, and feel seen and feel heard. And have a space where their language is being spoken to them.
That's great. Thank you, Jonoy. Hannah, if I could come to you next.
I think it's an interesting one to think about technology and how we use technology. And going back to Yamina's point, I reflect quite a lot on like private versus public networking. And I think that's where Twitter went wrong to a certain extent, because it was quite public, and LinkedIn can feel like that sometimes. But why I like LinkedIn is you can create groups on LinkedIn. So I've grown a lot of my networks by having very focused groups on LinkedIn, where we've got 850 women who are leaders in Baines, who are in our Baines Women Leadership Network. We've got 150 entrepreneurs in another one. So I think it's about segmenting it, like not just having everyone in one big sort of like melting pot that is your network, but having different groups you tap into. But going back to what Yamina and Jonoy both said, that those spaces are then safe where people can be authentic. So with the demise of X, and when we published our first book, The Manifesto, we launched our Mighty Network community space for that reason, because it's invite only, it's private, it's safe. There's 2,000 people in there, all from the Diverse Ed Network, who want to talk about DEIB. And we've not had a single issue in 2.5 years of anyone misbehaving in there, whereas we know that X became absolutely vile. So I think you have to have very clear rules of engagement and expectations of code of conduct. And I will be the bouncer. If you do cross the line, you will be kicked out. So I think it's that. But I think going back to Jonoy's point, it's also about like inviting people in. Going back to Yamina's point about extroversion, like there's some people who wouldn't necessarily bring themselves to that space. So it's actually about saying, oh, would you like to join our space? And I experienced something new last week. I went to an event where there's someone who set up a company called The First Hello, and she stands at the door and she welcomes everyone, because some people are nervous about even coming over the threshold. And when you arrive with friends, it's easy, isn't it? But when you arrive by yourself, it's really nerve-wracking. And Yamina will know this, Jonoy will know this. I'm often the person at the door hugging people, like the Hannah hug. And not everyone wants a hug. Some people need a hug, just like set themselves to come into the event. So I think there's also something about keeping it personal, because I think the hybrid or the technology can create a bit of a barrier sometimes where you don't actually know people either.
That's great. Thank you, Hannah. And Tim.
Yeah, I think that's so right, Hannah. And like looking at Andy's Man Club and the great work that they're doing, they now have a role called a sweeper role, which is outside the venue, because what they've recognised actually is a lot of men arrive and sit in their car and like finding getting out of the car really difficult, because talking's hard, right? So the sweeper actually goes and knocks on windows and says, oh, are you here for Andy's Man Club? Let me take you in for a biscuit. And I think it's such an important role to play to help guide people in. And I think we're really thinking about like how do we do that in person, but how do we do that virtually as well? Because that can be tricky as well. The camera off syndrome, I think, is something we need to get over. So we saw, similar to you, Hannah, like during lockdown, a huge spike in network attendance, like massive numbers, hundreds of people in rooms, captive audience. And then we saw that absolutely bottom out post-COVID. And like we really saw, I think, the additionality and goodwill that it takes to network, not dry up, but certainly reduce across the sector, which led to a lot of decisions around various networks and things. We have seen that kind of balance out recently, though, I think. If I was to make a big bet, and by the way, if anyone has the actual answer to this question, please email me. I'd love to know. But I would bet that the future of networking in education will shift towards professional advancement. This is just a me thing. It's just a big bet. I think there's gaps appearing in roles across the country, and I think places need brilliant people. And I think, coming right back to the start, Ben, where you said if you're in a different sector, law, consultancy, networking is part of the fabric of those sectors, right? And you network to get to know the people where you're going to get those roles. I think that's the space that's going to fill very, very soon. 40,000 people leave the sector every year. It's 8% of the workforce. Like, there's a reported kind of leadership crisis coming in education. So I think the people that kind of fill those spaces, I think will start to be the winners. So it's making sure that those spaces exist and are accessible by everybody.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And like you said, Tim, actually, if you were in other sectors, that is often, how a lot of people do get jobs and get opportunities is that. But also, actually thinking that those spaces are accessible for people and making sure that, if you're, again, this comes to something we've done at Step Up, is really try to make sure that any events that incur costs are really, really low, but also having an option that if even you can't afford that or you can't physically get there, is there a way we can support you to get there? Because there are people that need these spaces but actually can't get to them. We talk a lot about inclusion and things like that, but actually accessibility as well. And I know we've referenced that in terms of earlier, like with online platforms and so on. Thank you so much, everyone. I was really worried we wouldn't get through all 5 topics when I typed those questions up, and look at us, we have done it with even time to spare. So well done, everyone. That was a really great conversation. Thank you. And what I will be doing for those of you watching, I know there's been questions in the chat about can we get copies of the questions? Of course you can. What we'll do is we'll collate it probably into a blog and things like that, and maybe even, depending on it, clip it down by each topic and put that onto our YouTube channel, and we'll share that widely. Thank you, everyone, for attending. The only last thing I'm going to do before thanking our some wonderful speakers we've had tonight is just flag some other opportunities that we have to engage with us at Step Up. And thinking about that idea of networking was something that was brought up to us at our London event that we held this year, that actually some people said, we don't know how to network. We don't even know how to set up a LinkedIn profile. So we are going to be doing some CPD on that later in the year, which is free in May. There are some other events, as you can see on the screen there. Our Birmingham Lead Meet is our next face-to-face event. And we've got an event in London in June. And I would say the event in London in June, the birthday celebration, there's only about 3 tickets left. So if you do want to join us, please do get a ticket quickly. But last but by no means least, thank you so much to Yamina, Janoy, Hannah and Tim for joining me for International Leadership Week. It's the first time we've celebrated this as a network. So we're really pleased to be here with such a great topic. And also a huge thank you to the Institute of Leadership for curating this week and creating this space. And as it's only the Monday, so only the start of the week, I know that there are many events starting up and down the country today and more so tomorrow as well. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your evening. And in the power of networking, we hope to connect with you again very soon. Thank you.